Thank you for joining us. I'm Keith Tebow from FRCmedia. It's been a little while since we've spoken to the congressman that serves the city of Fall River, and we've got the distinct honor of actually having him in our studio for the first time. Congressman Jake Auchincloss, 4th Congressional District. Congressman, thank you for joining me. Welcome to our studios in person. We've spoken a lot virtually over the past 2 years, and it's good to see you face to face. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm doing well, and thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
You know, let me just start. This year, running unopposed. Obviously, 2 years ago, there was a highly contested Democratic primary. Then you had the general election. How different is it for you this year in that aspect, in terms of election season?
It's less stressful. Yeah. You know, in my first campaign, the very night that I won the primary, I drove my wife to Newton Wellesley Hospital because she had developed a kidney stone in the final week of the campaign because of the stress. And so I think, on behalf of my wife and me, this is certainly a less stressful way. Really what it comes down to, I think, is I made a huge effort to do 3 things in my first term. One is deliver excellent constituent services, because that's what the people of Massachusetts 4th deserve. And my district staff and I have really worked hard to build relationships with state reps and state senators, and to make sure that whether you're calling about an immigration issue, Social Security issue, IRS issue, or whether you want a flag flown on the top of the Capitol, we are responsive and we are getting results for you. That's number 1. Number 2, I've worked really hard to represent people's values. The day of the insurrection, I announced I'm not going to be co-sponsoring legislation with Republicans who voted against the election results, because I don't feel like I could represent the values of my constituents while working with Republicans in the 117th Congress who did not recognize free and fair elections and put the Constitution first. And the same thing with defending Roe against extremist attacks on women's right to make their own decisions with their physicians. And then finally, I've worked really hard to advance people's priorities. That's really ultimately the job in Congress, get things done. And I've worked hard to do that left, center, and right, working with Democrats of all persuasions and actually even working across the aisle to get things done.
So let me ask you, this is only your first term you're about to finish. And in the middle of that term, your district changed. Now you have the entire city of Fall River. Has that made a difference? And there's been some other shifts within the district as well, but has that made a difference in terms of, particularly maybe in 2022, on how you view serving the community? Because now you've got the entire city of Fall River instead of that northern part mainly.
Well, to be clear, so I actually do not start representing the full city
until 2023.
Until the next term. So the district does not change in the middle of the term, but it will,
right.
Which I'm very excited for. I can't wait to represent all of Fall River. And actually, this evening, I'm going to speak to the South End Association and introduce myself to the southern part of Fall River. Yeah. Fall River, I think, deserves to be the biggest city in its own congressional district, and now it will be. And I'm going to deepen and widen the already very strong relationships I have here in Fall River with people like Senator Rodericks, Mayor Coogan, Representative Fiola, and Representative Sylvia, and continue making sure I'm working hard to deliver on issues like public safety, water, and housing, which I know are critical for the Fall River citizens.
Still on people's minds since the beginning of this year is inflation and how it's impacted people's pocketbooks and their ability to pay their bills and continue to live where they're living. We're hearing energy increases, 60+% going up beginning this month in November. Yes. What as a congressman can you do to help the people, again, on the ground, to help them, overcome this? Because it looks like it's going to continue for quite a while.
Prices are too high. Yeah. Russia's unprovoked illegal invasion of Ukraine really was a global energy shock that has spiked energy prices here, in particular in Massachusetts. We're, of all the 50 states in the union, probably the most sensitive to European LNG prices. And so when there's problems in European energy markets, which there are because of the Ukraine invasion, they spill over into Massachusetts. In the long run, we've got to get off this roller coaster where every decision by a Saudi Arabia dictator, or Russia's decisions, or Venezuela, Iran, where all these geopolitical global shocks affect people's pocketbooks here in Massachusetts. Enough with the roller coaster. We need clean energy independence, and through initiatives like the clean energy tax credits that we approved this summer, we're going to be investing in offshore wind and battery technology and electrical grid resilience and fusion and fission and geothermal and a host of clean energy technologies that make America secure and energy cheap. In the immediate term, though, families need relief. The average family in a big chunk of the district I represent, including in Fall River, is going to see their energy bills for home heating go up by as much as $500 this winter. It's not acceptable. And so much of the New England delegation joined forces. We requested that the administration release home heating oil reserves from the Northeastern Reserve, and President Biden and Vice President Harris are doing so. And by releasing those energy reserves, we are going to put downward pressure on prices for families.
Now, you mentioned the energy reserves, and that has helped a little because President Biden released, some of the strategic oil reserves earlier this year, and it made a little bit of an impact in terms of gas prices. But you mentioned transitioning to a clean energy future. I would think that most Americans would agree with that, but we're sort of in between, right? Because that's not going to happen overnight. Mm-hmm. And is there a possibility that the country should start looking at, more local United States energy resources, reopening some of the pipelines? I know Keystone has been a big conversation in terms of President Biden shutting that down. Should the country relook at some of those things in the short term to try to relieve some of these energy pressures?
You're absolutely right that right now the United States is still heavily dependent on fossil fuels, mm-hmm. oil, natural gas in particular. And the way I view it is we are sailing towards a North Star. The North Star is clean energy independence. We want to generate our own energy here in the United States. We want it to be too cheap to meter, and we want it to be clean. We do not want to be polluting our air or our water for our kids. But in the short term, we've got this fossil fuel infrastructure. We have not yet scaled the clean energy technologies that we need. And so we've got to kind of tack back and forth with the wind and the waves towards that North Star. And LNG in particular, liquid natural gas and natural gas are a critical bridge technology for us. We ship in much of our LNG here in Massachusetts from Trinidad and Tobago. It goes into the port at Everett. And there was initially plans to close that port in 2024, for example. I think it's pretty clear that we can't close that port in 2024. We need this LNG or else home heating bills are going to spike. And so you're right that we have got to ensure that we are not getting towards clean energy independence on the backs of working families. That's not acceptable. We need to make sure we are keeping prices low.
Moving forward, we've had another number of conversations on some of the initiatives, and I want you to sort of review that over for your first 2 years of what you've brought back to Fall River. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of infrastructure money coming back here. You talked about water mm-hmm. and public safety. How important was it for you? And I guess did the pandemic help in some ways because of ARPA funding and the like to bring back some resources to Fall River?
Certainly, working with Mayor Coogan and the state delegation, we have been able to bring back significant resources to Fall River, close to $100 million all in. And that has gone towards the CSO issue, combined sewer overflow issue, that has gone towards public safety equipment, including dispatch equipment, that has gone towards economic development, a better Christmas parade, that has gone towards subsurface water infrastructure. Mm-hmm. It's gone towards economic development on Route 79, which is going to be a really critical part for housing development as well as tax revenue for the city. And my job in Washington, D.C. is not to decide what the priorities for Fall River should be. My job is to listen to Mayor Coogan, to Representative Fayol, to Senator Rodrigues, to Representative Sylvia, hear from them what the priorities for Fall River are, and then go fight for it and try to bring home those results. And I think working as a team, we have been very effective through the American Rescue Plan, through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Right now I'm working on an initiative through the National Science Foundation to try to get this money home.
You talk about reproductive rights for women. The Supreme Court in June overturned Roe versus Wade. I don't know if I've spoken to you about this since then, but in Massachusetts, in some ways, the state is fortunate in that statewide, the right for women to choose control over their body and their health issues has been somewhat codified in state law. And we hear nationally that it appears to be a big issue in the midterm election. It may not be so much so in Massachusetts, but how do you, in your mind, say, well, Massachusetts right now is safe in that area, while you're still trying to help other states get to where maybe Massachusetts is on this issue?
Absolutely. Two things. First, it's about values. Right. You're right, Massachusetts has, I think, probably the best reproductive rights law on the books of any state in the union, and a huge amount of credit goes to people like Representative Pat Haddad for getting that across the finish line a couple of years ago. She was very prescient in realizing how necessary it was going to be. But a lot of my constituents are not just focused on what does policy mean for me individually, what does it mean for my daughter individually. They also are focused on what kind of values do I want to impart as an American citizen, as a voter. And they care what happens in Tennessee, they care what happens in Georgia, and I'm a legislator in a national body, and I care what happens to Americans broadly. We're all in this together, and for those rights that we think are truly basic rights that need to be protected within our understanding of the Constitution, we've got to be fighting for them nationally, and I'm going to continue to do that. I also think that we should be extremely cautious in thinking that any one state is ever really insulated from bad federal policy. We also have very strong gun laws here in Massachusetts. I'll use this as an example. Very strong gun laws have saved tens of thousands of lives, and yet the Supreme Court's recent decision about New York's handgun policies already, I think, is going to make Massachusetts less safe, because it's going to take away some of the power that local police chiefs had to deny carry permits to people who frankly shouldn't have them.
Yeah.
So national policy, even if your state has good laws, can pierce through and make you less safe.
I want to talk a little bit about the rest of the session. We are in early November. There's still a month and a half or so to go when you're back in session to get things done in a lame duck session, regardless of how the election turns out. What are some of your priorities to hope to get through between now and, for you, Inauguration Day in 2023?
Well, I'll tell you what, just the day after the election, next week on November 9th, I'm hosting an affordable housing conference, doing it in Attleboro. I hope our listeners will attend. Information will be on my website. And I'm bringing in Juana Matias, who is the regional HUD administrator for New England area. And we're going to talk about what the federal government is doing and how we can better partner with our local stakeholders in funding and regulations for affordable housing. It is, I think, the single biggest problem in Massachusetts is the cost of housing. And I want to demonstrate that at the federal level, I'm here to be a partner to the incoming gubernatorial administration to make housing more affordable in Massachusetts. So that's one thing I'm focused on here in Massachusetts. In terms of what we're going to pass in Congress, we got to pass a budget, and I think we're going to do that. And I will be working to avoid cuts to Medicare. Democrats have been very clear that we are here to protect and strengthen Medicare. Republicans have talked repeatedly about cutting it or privatizing it. It's critical that we protect it and protect it from cuts. And I also want to pass the Electoral Count Act Reform Act. This would strengthen the integrity of our elections to prevent a repeat of January 6th.
Now, obviously, a lot of what you do in the House, and we've seen this for the past almost 2 years now, tends to get stymied or stifled or blocked in the Senate because of the 50-50 split. Through the rest of the year, do you see any potential wiggle room to get some of the things that have already been passed in the House still waiting to be voted on in the Senate? We go back to Build Back Better, right? And elements of that seem to get blocked. Do you feel that there's a possibility that after the election things may free up a little bit?
The best example of that would be the Electoral Count Act reform.
Right.
So this is what I was referring to. It secures the integrity of our elections, not comprehensively. We still need a lot of work to do at the state level, but the federal level, it plugs the biggest loophole that was trying to be exploited by Trump on January 6th. That is a much more tightly scoped version of what we passed in the House, but it has the votes in the Senate, and it would still be significant progress. So that one, to me, is the biggest example of what you're referring to.
Yeah. Moving forward, the January 6th committee still doing its work. They have not finalized or published a final report. Do you envision, even though you're not in that committee, that will happen? Yes. And what do you hope what will the next steps you hope will be, maybe with the Justice Department taking some of the recommendations, some of the findings?
Yeah, I won't get ahead of the January 6th Commission in terms of their recommendations to DOJ or others. I think they have already, if they never had another meeting, which they will, but if they never had another meeting, they have already laid out a searing fact pattern for the American public and for posterity, that there was grotesque, widespread subversion of the Constitution. There was incitement to insurrection. These are illegal. These are unconstitutional. They should prevent Donald Trump or his henchmen from holding federal office in the future. And we need to prosecute it to the fullest extent of the law.
What does this mean going forward? Are you hopeful that the political climate can change at all? I mean, it's been very divisive for a while now.
Yeah.
Is there any hope that in the shorter term, 2-4 years, that things can get better, there can be better compromise in both chambers of Congress?
Well, let me say two things, and they might seem somewhat contradictory.
Yeah.
The first is that Congress works a lot better than cable news or social media would have you believe. Those two entities monetize outrage. They look for clicks, they look for eyeballs, and they do that by telling people that things are terrible and here's who to blame for it. If you actually look at what Congress did in the 117th term, bipartisan infrastructure law, bipartisan science and semiconductor manufacturing law, bipartisan gun safety law, bipartisan anti-lynching law, bipartisan support for Ukraine, and additionally, tremendous aid to localities through the American Rescue Plan, done just by Democrats, and the biggest, boldest climate action and clean energy commitment in history, done just by Democrats. So this was an unbelievably productive Congress. Some of it was done with Republican votes, some of it was not. And I think what that demonstrates is that when Democrats have the White House and have Congress, we get things done for the American people, real substantive progress, and we also are able to do it in a bipartisan way when the GOP can debate in good faith. So that is I think an important thing for Americans to remember is pierce through some of the noise you hear on cable news and social media and really dig into the results. On the second hand, I'm certainly not going to try to refute the fact that it can be a deeply polarized place. And unfortunately, the antics of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and her extremist allies drown out a lot of more serious-minded people in Congress. And ultimately, the GOP needs to excise this cancer on itself of MAGA extremism that is not committed to democracy, that's not committed to pluralism, that's not committed to free and open debate. Until the GOP can do that, it's hard for me to see it as a sustainable governing partner.
Let me just ask you, sort of on the record, off the record, some of your Republican colleagues that may not be necessarily full in on the MAGA side of things, have they mentioned the fact that, boy, I wish we could be more of a conservative party traditionally that we have seen prior to maybe even 2016, 2012 and before?
Yes.
Yeah.
There were, don't quote me on this number,
Sure.
something like 130 members of the GOP conference that voted against the election results on January 6th, for example. And 130 of those, I mean, that does not mean that 130 people believed the complete nonsense of the big lie. Mm-hmm. It means that 130 of those people were scared. They were scared of getting primaried, they were scared of the MAGA base, they were scared of Donald Trump tweeting something meaning about them. What we have in Washington, D.C. is not a deficit of understanding, we have a deficit of political courage. Mm. And until the GOP can find that courage to stand up to its extremist elements, you're going to continue to see this kind of quietly GOP members saying, boy, I wish we could go back to the Romney days, but publicly, bending a knee to Donald Trump. And that to me that's not acceptable. That's not what their job is. Their job is to speak truth to power and to represent their constituents.
How do you rate the Biden administration and Congress in terms of some foreign policy issues? Ukraine comes to mind. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Congress, working with the president, continues to support aid to Ukraine. Do you expect that to continue?
I do. I've worked hard to champion bipartisan support for the strategic defeat of Russia and Ukraine. Liz Cheney and I have authored an op-ed about the importance of that and rallied our respective parties to it. I've worked on bipartisan letters to Treasury about the implementation of energy sanctions on Russia. So I've been very engaged on this issue of politics stops at the water's edge, and we need to support Ukraine as they fight on the front lines of the free world. The president's initiative in Ukraine has been successful. As we see, Ukraine's on the march. And it really has three parts to it. One is support for Ukraine, economic and military. Two is sanctions on Russia, central bank, commercial, and energy. And three is our alliances, NATO and East Asia. And he has been masterful in making sure that those three initiatives independently are successful, but also that they're working together to strengthen each other. And I am going to be working very hard in the 118th to ensure that we are continuing to support the president's successful strategy.
There were a number of members on the progressive side of the Democrat Party that sent a letter to President Biden asking him to sit down at the negotiating table with Ukraine and Russia to work things out. I know you condemn that. How difficult, even within party, with some of these issues to try to get everyone on the same page. I know everyone has individual opinions,
Yeah.
but sometimes something like this can be
Well, to be clear, the letter actually asked for the president to sit down with just Russia.
just Russia. Right. Right.
And they rescinded that letter, which is the right thing to do. And I'm not interested so much in the politics of who signed or anything like that. It's more about good versus bad foreign policy. As I explained, we have a good foreign policy in place regarding Ukraine. It has had bipartisan support to date. We should not allow there to be cracks in that bipartisan support on either side. And Republicans have been saying some concerning things in the run up to the midterms as well about their support for Ukraine. We have got to send a clear message to the authoritarian regime in Moscow and in Beijing that might does not make right, and that the United States is going to stand with freedom and democracy.
I want to look a little bit ahead as you head into your second full term in January. You currently sit on the Transportation Committee. Are you happy there? You're looking to maybe get on another committee? What are your thoughts in terms of your future?
I am happy on transportation infrastructure. I also serve on financial services. Right. Financial services has jurisdiction on housing, which, as I said earlier, to me, affordable housing is probably the #1 challenge in Massachusetts right now. And on transportation infrastructure, we're going to have a chance to supervise and oversee the distribution of funds that we passed last Congress in the bipartisan infrastructure law. A lot of the policy actually happens in the spending of the money, in the actual grant making. And so our supervision of that will give me a seat at the table, make sure Massachusetts is getting what it needs. Having said that, there's a lot of shuffling around post midterms and committee assignments and a lot of different factors at play there. I'm happy where I'm at, but I'm also going to make sure I end up on a committee where I can engage on the policies that have the greatest import of the day and that have the most impact for my constituents.
One final question. You know that you were a city councilor and now a congressman. Usually when an election is over, the next day they're talking about the next one, right? In 2 years, another presidential election. Would you support President Biden for a second term?
One election at a time. Right now I'm focused on the midterms.
Yeah. All right, Congressman Auchincloss, I appreciate your time. Thank you for coming to Fall River, joining us in our studio, and I hope to talk again soon. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it. Thank you for joining us here at FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. Have a great day.